Great crowd tonight. I'm Steve Pettyjohn. I'm here with Bob Pence and Paul Kaparoff, who's hiding over there, raising his hand. And we're really excited about tonight's presentation. In fact, as we got into this, and we've been working on this for several months, we came to the conclusion that in order to do justice to this story, that it was going to have to be a two-parter. And as we schedule a ways in advance, part 2 will be in December, but that's okay. Tonight we're starting it on this date because in 1942, in the time between the Battle of Midway on June 4th and the invasion of Guadalcanal on August 7th, real time, is the time between our two meetings, okay? And we're going to keep reminding you of what an incredible thing. So whatever you did this summer, King and Nimitz and all those guys were a hell of a lot busier, okay? But I always get to give a preview of coming attractions. And our next meeting will be September 2nd. And it will be presented by the folks at the Liberty Museum, and they're going to be talking about PT boats in keeping with our Pacific War theme. And apparently they got a new one over there they want you to come look at. So, okay, so that's September 2nd. Our meeting in October is going to be at a different time and date. And that's because the Friends of the Library will be getting ready for their big annual fall sale, in which they use this room and several others to sell books to make money to give to the library. So we won't be able to meet on our usual Tuesday meeting. We will meet on Wednesday, October 1st. The subject will be Douglas MacArthur, hero or heel. Okay. October 1st, I think, is
Yes.
Wednesday, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. October 1st. November is going to be very interesting in keeping with it's Veterans Month, okay? We're going to have Dave Ressler from Lutheran Weston, one of his students, on researching your military ancestors. And they've done that, so it ought to be really, really interesting. And then in December, we'll do part 2 of this, and we're firming up our programs for next year, but we're not ready to announce that yet. I can tell you that Mel Mauer's involved for what that's worth, okay? All right, so, word from our sponsor, library. Please complete these and turn them in. Chad appreciates it. We look at them when we meet to talk about what we're going to do next. We do look at these, okay? So please fill these out and turn them in. So I am now going to turn this over to Bob Pence.
Good evening. Hi, Bob. Let's see if I can do this. I don't know if the microphone's be close enough. If I need to get it closer, let me know. Our topic this evening is the Guadalcanal campaign. I'm Bob Pence. I'm going to present the introductory overview and the land portion of the campaign. Steve will come up and present the air and naval portion of the campaign. Then Paul Kaparoff, who has visited Guadalcanal in the last 5 years,
Yes.
Brought some relics that he brought back, and will has some pictures for you from his visit there. The campaign lasted 6 months, and we're going to cover through, as Steve mentioned, mid-October this evening. The second half of the campaign will be covered in December. Here's a list of the books that we used as references for tonight's presentation, and Steve brought a number of the books here for you to take a look at. I recommend Neptune's Inferno, which is a comprehensive book on the campaign. Before we get to the Guadalcanal campaign, let's take a quick review of the coverage of the war in the Pacific over the last couple of months. This map shows, if you look at the red line, the extent of the Japanese advances in the Pacific up to the start of the Guadalcanal campaign in August 1942. The war for the U.S. started with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, which we've covered in 2 previous presentations here. In May, Steve Pettyjohn presented the fall of the Philippines from December 8, 1941 to May 6, 1942. And in June, Mark Porter presented Midway, which occurred on June 4th, 1942. Tonight we'll discuss the Guadalcanal campaign. I think it would be helpful for your understanding of the campaign if we start with a little bit of geography. As you can see, the Solomon Islands are in the South Pacific area in the lower right-hand corner there, and Guadalcanal is part of the Solomon Island chain. So why was Guadalcanal of importance to the Allies? Well, if you look, the Japanese were threatening the resupply route to Australia from the U.S. So we wanted to defend that supply route. Before we jump into Guadalcanal, I want to talk about one other battle that occurred here prior to Guadalcanal, and that's the Battle of the Coral Sea from May 4th to May 8th, 1942. It basically stopped the advance of the Japanese from going into Australia. It was the first aircraft carrier battle of the war in the Pacific in World War II. The second was the Battle of Midway, and the third and fourth carrier battle will occur as part of the Guadalcanal campaign. The other area of note is are the New Hebrides here. It was a jointly held colony by the French and British before the war. And with the fall of France to Germany in 1940, the British took over more control of the island. The Australians put 2,000 troops on Malekula to try and prevent, in the event of an invasion by the Japanese into Australia. The U.S. also put troops there starting in May 1942 because now the New Hebrides was on the front line basically of the war. And we created bases at Espiritu Santo and Afate. As part of the deployment, some 50,000 troops were stationed on these two military bases. The population of the islands was only 40,000. This was a forward supply base for the Americans, and was used as the supply base for the battle of the Guadalcanal campaign. We had the ability to supply fuel, food, and ammunition. They were able to do ship repairs, and as you'll see, as part of the naval battles, there were a lot of ship repairs to do. This is one of the auxiliary floating dry docks that was at Espiritu Santo, the USS Artisan. It was the largest of the three at Espiritu Santo. And again, as the ships were damaged in the battles around Guadalcanal, they would go down here for repairs. Espiritu Santo was also an area for R&R. And the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical South Pacific was based upon activities at Espiritu Santo. They also built an airfield on Espiritu Santo so that they could have bombers fly to bomb Guadalcanal. The airfield was built in 20 days. They worked around the clock. The CBs came in, of the famous fighting CBs of John Wayne. CB stands for Construction Battalion. They ended up building 4 airfields on Espiritu Santo. First picture was from December 1943. This is a picture of the airfield in 2020. The other area of geography that I want to talk about is the Solomon Islands, of which Guadalcanal is a part. The Solomon Islands is an archipelago of about 1,000 islands, from small coral atolls to large volcanic mountainous islands. Let's go back one. The northern islands of Solomons were controlled by the Germans. They made a protector of it in the late 1800s, and the United Kingdoms took over the southern islands of the Solomons. In World War I, Australia defeated took over the sections that the Germans controlled in both New Guinea and Bougainville. And after the war, they were mandated New Guinea, so it went from being German New Guinea to Australian New Guinea. This area, again, was important to the Japanese. The Battle of Rabaul occurred in January 1942 through February 1942, and the Japanese turned Rabaul into a major naval repair base. They also took Kavieng on the island of New Ireland, and these two ports ended up being the Espiritu Santo and Ifate for the Japanese, that the forward supply bases similar to Espiritu Santo and Ifate. The other area that I want to talk about is the slot. The slot was the New Georgia Sound, and it was a channel that was used for merchant shipping before the war. But this is what the route that the Japanese took to resupply Guadalcanal from Rabaul and the Shortland Islands, which are the southeastern side of Bougainville. They were able to make the run of the slot in one night, but they used destroyers and cruisers because of the airplanes at Henderson Field, and they didn't want to subject their transport ships, which moved a lot slower, to air attack. So they would run the slot at night. But the downside to that was they weren't able to take heavy equipment, so they didn't have a whole lot of field artillery, heavy field artillery on Guadalcanal, or trucks, or food and ammunition sometimes. The Americans call the slot the Tokyo Express, because that's the way the Japanese got their troops down to Guadalcanal. And the Japanese called it rat transportation. So here's a picture you can see of Guadalcanal and the relative distances of the forward supply bases that I just talked about, of Espiritu Santo and Ifate for the Americans, and Kavieng and Rabaul for the Japanese. So let's take a closer look at Guadalcanal itself. In order to safeguard their strategic operating base at Rabaul, New Britain, the Japanese captured Tulagi on May 3rd, 1942, and occupied nearby Guadalcanal on June 8th in order to construct and support a base and airfield. These footholds in the British administered Solomon Islands also supported Japan's southwest thrust into New Guinea and Australia. Following the victory at Midway, Chief of Naval Operations and Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King was able to assert the Navy's command primacy in the Pacific and overcame resistance by the U.S. Army to immediate offensive operations against Japan. Thus, Operation Watchtower, conceived and planned in under a month, only encompassed the sea services. 8 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the 1st Marine Division, supported by naval air and gunnery support, landed at Beach Red on Guadalcanal and on Tulagi and its adjacent islets. This was the first major American amphibious operation of World War II. Attention was directed to the Eastern Solomons because of the recent Japanese occupation of positions in this area. In addition, strategists recognized that the islands provided a natural avenue of approach for the significant Japanese naval base of Rabaul on the island of New Britain to the west. An operation in the Solomons also would serve to cover the flank of a concurrent drive being orchestrated in New Guinea by General Douglas MacArthur. Within the Solomons, the Allied planners first focused their attention on the islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. Tulagi was the capital of the British Solomon Island Protectorate, and Gavutu was the site of an Australian seaplane base. The Japanese wanted to capture the seaplane base for their own use to support future advances south. They initially overlooked the much larger island to the south, and those three, to the south of those three, Guadalcanal, which gave the ensuing campaign its historical name. The decision to land there was an afterthought resulting from radio intelligence information in early July received from Coast Watcher Major Martin Clemens that the Japanese were constructing an air base on that island. The battle will begin on August 7th, 1942, with the amphibious landing of the 1st Marine Division and the supporting regiment of a supporting regiment from the 2nd Marine Division. This slide shows the organization of the 1st Marine Division as it looked on paper. Marine and Army divisions in World War II had what was called a triangular organization. What this means was that an infantry division would have 3 infantry regiments. In this case, each regiment was the equivalent size of a brigade today. We don't do the regiments anymore. In this case, the Marines' 1st, 5th, and 7th infantry regiments, each of which had 3 infantry battalions. At full strength, an infantry regiment would have 3,168 men. The infantry was supported by a field artillery regiment, in this case the 11th Marine Regiment, which had 5 field artillery battalions. 3 of the battalions had 75mm pack howitzers, and they were direct support for the infantry regiments. There was also then a 155mm battalion and a new 105mm battalion that was in general support. When the division sailed from the U.S., the 105mm battalion was in the process of being formed and was short certain items of material and about 40% of its personnel. The various howitzers were towed by 4x4 trucks. Here's a picture of a 75mm pack howitzer on Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division was sent from the U.S. to New Zealand for additional training with the expectation of not being used until January 1st, 1943 at the earliest. Operation Watchtower changed all of that. Upon arrival in New Zealand, the Marines had a couple of days to turn around, reload the ships for combat operations. To add further complications, the dock workers in Wellington, New Zealand were on strike, and it was the Marines themselves that had to load the ships. The limitations of tonnage made it necessary to leave behind the 155mm battalion, from whose personnel and material the 105mm battalion was then completed. This same difficulty made it necessary for them to leave behind a portion of the motor transport as well. Since they were not completely motorized to begin with, this was a serious handicap. For Watchtower, the 1st Raider Battalion and the 3rd Defense Battalion had been added to the command to provide more infantrymen and much needed coast defense and anti-aircraft guns and crews. This corps of artillery, infantry and artillery was then supported by these 7 specialized battalions, which included a tank battalion, special weapons, and the 1st Parachute Battalion would also play a key role. So this is what they were supposed to have. Let's take a look at what they actually had. Yes, sir?
Just back on the previous slide, were there any Japanese on the island that was to the northeast? I think it was called Malaita.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah. That is the largest island in the Solomon chain, but the reason that the Americans were interested in this is because they had occupied Guadalcanal and Tulagi and Gavutu. Nothing I read said that they had not done anything on Malaita.
Was that the same tack gun that's down at the Great Armory?
That I don't know. I've not seen the gun down to the Great Armory.
I think it is.
I might have to ask the Lieutenant Colonel down
The 1st Marine Division was activated on February 1st, 1941, and was formed from the 1st Marine Brigade. At the time, the strength of the brigade was approximately 2,000 officers and men. At the time of the Pearl Harbor, the division had 518 officers and 6,871 enlisted men. By June 31st, 1942, just before Guadalcanal, the division increased its strength to 577 officers and 11,753 men, enlisted men, for a total of 12,330 men. The design strength of the division was 19,514 men, so they were about 2/3 of the design strength. The division commander was Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, who took over command of the division on March 23rd, 1942. He led the landing force Transport Group X-Ray on Guadalcanal and received the Medal of Honor for his actions from August 7th to December 9th, 1942, during the Solomon Islands campaign. He later served as the 18th Commandant of the Marine Corps from 1944 to 1947, and was the first Marine officer on active duty to attain 4-star rank. Brigadier General William H. Rupertus was the Assistant Division Commander. He commanded the landing force, Transport Group Yoke, which captured the islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. Formation of a new brigade for immediate service in the Samoan area was built around the 7th Marines reinforced, which withdrew from the division a considerable number of officers, non-commissioned officers, and men trained and experienced in amphibious warfare. The loss was too great to overcome immediately, so the division was reconstituted as a 2-regiment division with supporting units. So the 7th Marines are gone. It remained a 2-regiment division until the arrival of the 7th Marines at Guadalcanal on September 18, 1942. And I just rewatched to make sure I have all my facts right, the Pacific, the HBO series Pacific, and you see the 7th Marines coming in with all their clean uniforms and the 1st Marine Regiment with their tattered uniforms. And the one guy from the 7th says, "We're coming from Samoa." It remained a 2-regiment division until the arrival of at which point it went back to the original triangular organization. As mentioned earlier, there wasn't room on the ships to allow the 155mm field artillery to make the initial landing on Guadalcanal. This battalion of artillery wouldn't make it to the island until November 1942. Additionally, the direct support field artillery battalion of the 7th Marine Regiment went with them, so the 11th Marine Regiment only had 3 of its 5 battalions. So we're down 2 battalions in the artillery. Also failing to make the cut in the battle for shipping space were all spare clothing, bedding rolls, supplies necessary to support the reinforced division beyond 60 days of combat, 10 days of supply of ammunition for each of the division weapons remained in New Zealand. There were combat veteran officers and non-commissioned officers throughout the division, but the majority of the men were going into their first battle. The commanding officer of the 1st Marines, Colonel Clifton B. Cates, estimated that 90% of his men had enlisted after Pearl Harbor. This is the famous 1st Marine Division patch, which was created in 1943 to recognize the sacrifice and victory of the Marines that fought in the Battle of Guadalcanal in 1942. Do we have any Marines here? Hoorah. Hoorah!
Is there any reason why it's named Guadalcanal? Is there a canal on that island? Or?
That's just, it was the Spanish that originally found the island. They named it after a city in Spain of Guadalcanal. But that's not in my time limit, so. But I did know the answer. So. And if you would have given me more time, I would have given you that history also.
Fine, that's good.
The 2nd Marine Regiment, or 2nd Marine Regiment of the 2nd Marine Division also participated on the landings on the 7th and 8th of August. They were primarily on the islands of Gavutu and Tanambogo and Florida Island. It's the morning of August 7th, 1942. Transport Group Yoke, led by Assistant Division Commander Brigadier General Rupertus, has the mission of taking Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. Unlike their comrades who invaded Guadalcanal, The Marines landing on these islands met fierce resistance. Bad weather allowed the Allied Expeditionary Force to arrive in the vicinity of Guadalcanal unseen by the Japanese on the morning of August 7th. The Japanese detected the radio traffic from the incoming Allied invasion force and prepared to send scout aircraft aloft at daybreak. Aircraft from the aircraft carrier USS Wasp dive-bombed Japanese installations on Tulagi, Gavutu, Tenambogo, and Florida, and strafed and destroyed 15 Japanese seaplanes floating in the anchorages near the islands. The cruiser USS San Juan and the destroyers Monson and Buchanan bombarded planned landing sites on Tulagi and Florida Island. 2 of these ships would not survive the Guadalcanal campaign. To cover the assault on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, U.S. Marines from the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marine Regiment made an unopposed landing on Florida Island at 0740. They were guided to their objective by several Australians who were familiar with the Tulagi, Florida area from having previously lived or worked in the area. At 0800, 2 battalions of U.S. Marines, including the 1st Raider Battalion under Colonel Merritt A. Edson of Edson's Raider fame, and the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines under Lieutenant General Harold E. Rosecrans, no apparent relationship to William Rosecrans of Civil War fame, made an unopposed landing on the western shore of Tulagi. About halfway between the 2 ends of the oblong-shaped island, pre-invasion aerial reconnaissance revealed that the strongest defenses on Tulagi fronted the northeast and southeast shorelines, so down this area. Therefore, the Marines selected a 500-yard stretch of beach named Beach Blue, midway on the southwest side of the island for the landing. The idea was to make the first American amphibious assault on the water of the war against natural obstacles instead of enemy firepower. Beds of coral near the shore kept the landing craft from reaching the shoreline. The Marines, however, were able to wade the remaining 100 yards without hindrance from the Japanese forces, who were apparently taken by surprise by the landings and had yet to begin an organized resistance. The island of Tulagi is 2 miles long and a half-mile wide. It lies just south of Florida Island and 22 miles directly north across Sea Lark Channel from Guadalcanal. A ridge rising over 300 feet above the sea marks the northwest-southeast axis of the island. About 2/3 of the way down from its northwest tip, the ridge is broken by a ravine, and then rises again in a triangle of hills, the farthest southeast designated Hill 208, and the farthest northeast Hill 281, named after their elevation in feet. Tulagi had been the seat of the British Solomon Island Protectorate, with the governor's residence and other governmental structures located on its northeast side. About 3,000 yards east of Tulagi are the small islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo, joined by a 500-yard-long causeway. The Japanese garrison on Tulagi and Gavutu, which were a detachment of the 3rd Kerr Special Naval Landing Force, plus members of the Yokohama Air Group, commanded by Colonel Shigetoshi Miyazaki, a force of about 310 men on Tulagi and 536 plus men, plus about 40 civilian technicians on Gavutu and Tanambogo, signaled their commander at Rabaul, Rear Admiral Sadayoshi Yamada, that they were under attack, were destroying their equipment and paper, and signed off with the message, quote, "Enemy troop strength is overwhelming. We will defend to the last man," end quote. Masaki Suzuki, commander of the Special Naval Landing Force unit on Tulagi, ordered his troops into prepared defensive positions. Marines of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment secured the northwest end of Tulagi without opposition, and then joined Edson's Raiders in their advance toward the southeastern end of the island. The Marines advanced toward the southeast throughout the day while defeating a few isolated pockets of Japanese resistance. Around noon, Suzuki repositioned his main defense into a line on a hill called Hill 281 and a nearby ravine at the southeast end of the island. The Japanese defenses on Hill 281 included a dozen tunneled caves dug in the hill's limestone cliffs and machine gun pits protected by sandbags. The Marines reached these defenses near dusk, realized that they didn't have enough daylight left for a full-scale attack, and dug in for the night. During the night, the Japanese employed tactics that became hallmarks of their savage defense of Pacific strongholds, including ambushes, the plentiful use of snipers, savage nocturnal counterattacks, and stealthy infiltration of American lines by small groups of Japanese soldiers. About 10 p.m., the Japanese mounted a fierce counterattack. Savage assaults were fended off. They attacked the Marine line 5 more times, beginning at 22:30. The Japanese temporarily broke through the Marine lines and captured a machine gun, but were quickly thrown back. After taking a few more casualties, the Marine lines held through the rest of the night. The Japanese suffered heavy losses in the attacks. The morning of August 8th, the Marines, after landing reinforcements from 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, surrounded Hill 281 and the ravine, pounded both locations with mortar fire throughout the morning, and then assaulted the 2 positions using improvised explosive charges to kill the Japanese defenders taking cover in the caves at the fighting positions throughout the hill and ravines. By 3 p.m., the tenacious and often suicidal Japanese resistance on Tulagi was broken. The battle had cost the Marines 45 dead and 76 wounded. The Japanese suffered 347 killed and just 3 captured. While the fighting raged on Tulagi, the 1st Parachute Battalion under Major Robert H. Williams was tasked with capturing Gavutu and Tanambogo. Gavutu is roughly 500 yards long, while Tanambogo is even smaller. They are connected by a 500-yard crushed coral causeway. The attack was to commence 4 hours after the landing on Tulagi at noon. Insufficient numbers of landing craft to conduct both the Tulagi and Gavutu operations dictated that the landings could not occur simultaneously. As a result, the defenders on Gavutu and Tanambogo were prepared for the enemy's assault. Each of those islets was dominated by a single elevation, Hill 148 on Gavutu and Hill 121 on Tanambogo. The islands were surrounded by coral reefs that allowed an approach only from the east. The terrain channeled any attacker into a narrow funnel dominated by the high ground on 2 sides. Defending Gavutu were about 240 men, mostly laborers from the 14th Construction Unit, buttressed by a 50-man platoon of the 3rd Kerr Special Naval Landing Force. On Tanambogo were the 303 crew and maintenance personnel of the Yokohama Flying Base Air Group under Captain Miyazaki. Only the Special Naval Landing Force members were equipped and trained to fight as ground troops. However, the constricted terrain as well as defensive positions greatly aided the other defenders, allowing them to give a good account of themselves. The Japanese on both islands, entrenched in bunkers and caves, and each spit of land was with mutual machine gun fire support of the other. So this is what we call a good firebox for the Japanese. As the parachutists approached Gavutu Harbor at noon, the island was rocked by a 5-minute naval bombardment carried out again by the light anti-aircraft cruiser USS San Juan and the destroyers Monson and Buchanan, followed by a 10-minute air assault by dive bombers from the aircraft carrier Wasp. The efforts did little damage to the Japanese defenses. After getting ashore, the attackers of the first wave were met with a withering fire from the Japanese on Hill 148 and 121. The 2nd and 3rd waves landed on the docks and immediately came under Japanese rifle and machine gun fire so heavy that in a few minutes 10% of both units were cut down, including the battalion commander. By 2 p.m., elements of the Company A and Company B had taken Hill 148. After extensive use of grenades and improvised explosive charges, as well as close-quarter fighting to clear the many fortified positions on the heights. When night fell on the 7th, Gavutu was still not secured, and Tanambogo had yet to be taken. The acting battalion commander, Major Charles A. Miller, who had replaced the injured Major Williams, requested reinforcements. General Rupertus responded to Miller's appeal by sending Company B 2nd Marines, then on Florida Island, to subdue Tanambogo. After landing under heavy fire and suffering severe losses, they evacuated their wounded on boats and had them sail back to Gavutu. The Japanese lost only 10 men in the aborted assault on Tanambogo that day. Throughout the night, the Japanese staged persistent attacks against the Marines on Gavutu under the cover of heavy rain and thunderstorms. Hoping to get his attack on Gavutu moving, General Vandergrift orders his last reserves, the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, still embarked on ships off Guadalcanal to prepare to assault Tanambogo on August 8th. They began landing on Gavutu at 10 a.m. on August 8th and assisted in destroying the remaining Japanese defenses on that islet, which was completed by noon. With Gavutu pacified by noon, an attack on Tanambogo was ordered for 15:30 after a 30-minute naval bombardment by San Juan and Buchanan, the latter firing at close range. At 16:20, Company I, in conjunction with 2 M5 Stuart light tanks, reached the island by water. One tank assailed Hill 121 from the south, while the other did the same from the east. Both metal monsters were closely supported by Marines. The 2nd Armor fighting vehicle was able to knock out enough enemy bunkers using a 37mm main gun to allow a platoon to charge across the causeway onto Tanambogo at 4:40 p.m. This provided the needed muscle to finally break the Japanese hold on the island. Although the island was declared secure by 9 p.m. on August 8th, isolated night attacks by the Japanese continued. It was not until the next day, after savage fighting with bayonet, rifle butt, and hand grenades, that the remaining defenders on Tanambogo were completely eliminated. Of the 1,300 men committed, 70 Marines were killed and 87 wounded during the fight for Gavutu and Tanambogo. The Japanese lost 516 killed and 20 prisoners, 15 of whom were Korean laborers who had fought alongside their Japanese masters. American deaths sustained in the capture of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo totaled 115, while 863 Japanese perished in the 3 engagements. The actual American strength in the operation was hard to pin down accurately, with some sources saying the strength was as high as 7,500 men. Shortly after Tulagi was taken, the Marines' Gavutu anchorage began serving as a giant naval base and refueling station. Tulagi's harbor also functioned as a temporary repair center for vessels damaged in the many naval battles that occurred in the Guadalcanal vicinity between August and December 1942. Later in the campaign for Guadalcanal, Tulagi became a USPT boat base. After Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo were firmly in American hands, the majority of the Marines who wrested these islands away from the Japanese were eventually transferred to Guadalcanal to help defend Henderson Field from repeated attempts by the Japanese Army to recapture it. Now let's take a look at the Transport Group X-ray and the landings on Guadalcanal. The island has a total land area of 2,047 square miles, characterized by its mountainous terrain, dense jungle, and coastal plains. It has a low-lying coastal plain on the north side of the island and a mountainous region and coastline on the southern side of the island. The ground action that took place during the war primarily occurred on the northern coastal plains and on the western half of the island. Some key landmarks that I want to point out are Lunga Point, Coley Point, and Cape Esperance. Additionally, you can see that there are a number of rivers on the north side of the island. I want to highlight 3 of them. The Botanica River, the Lunga River, and the Tenaru River, which will be relevant to the early engagements. While we were in this area, I also want to mention Mount Austin. A battle occurred here in December 1942, but this is the site where Paul Kaparoff found the dog tags he brought this evening from his visit to Guadalcanal. Paul, you want to say a few words?
I spent about a day rooting around, digging around at Mount Austin. And with the help of a local guide, I used his metal detector, which I don't normally use, but I was able to find about 20 dog tags. At the time finding them, I couldn't read them because they were all crusted with mud and dirt and rust. So I had to soak them for quite a while when I got home. And some I was able to read, others I was not. But what's unique, this particular one here, during the early years of the war, the soldier's name was on it, his service number and so forth, but they also put the name of a spouse in a home of record. This was done not only in the Pacific, but also in Europe. Well, the government finally decided, hey, that's not a good idea, because if you were captured, you could use that information as to where he's from, go back and you'll use the family name or search it out. So they eliminated that. Now, some of the dog tags, as the gentleman I was talking to, had a notch in them. None of these do. But the notch, if you know what it was used for, it was put with the body, shoved in the mouth, and the mouth was jammed shut. One stayed with the records of the Gray's registration. The other one was with the body. So they always knew who it belonged to. Now, I do have 3 dog tags here with me, and I've been trying to research them. And the Marine Corps is a little tight with their records. Some I found easily. One I have here on the table, it was DRO, which means he was drowned. Others wounded in action, later died of wounds. But I'm still researching quite a few of these. I found Navy ones, and the Navy were corpsmen. The Army had medics. The Marines had Navy corpsmen. Those were the local, not really doctors, but medics.
Thank you, Paul. At 9:10 a.m., August 7th, 1942, the first wave of Marines of Combat Group A scrambled ashore on Guadalcanal between Coley Point and Lunga Point on Beach Red, quickly establishing a 2,000-yard long, 600-yard deep beachhead. Their surprise arrival met no organized Japanese ground resistance. And again, if you've seen the video series, The Pacific, you know, the guys are sitting on the beach waiting for the next group to come in. Approximately 2,500 laborers, mostly Korean, of the 11th and 13th Construction Unit, along with a few dozen regular Japanese soldiers, melted into the island's jungle as the Americans came ashore. The only threats to the Marines that day came from a number of mostly ineffective Japanese air raids launched from Rabaul. By nightfall, the Americans had carved out a 1-mile deep toehold on Guadalcanal. They halted for the night about 1,000 yards from the unfinished Japanese airfield near Lunga Point. The next day, August 8th, the Marines, meeting only sporadic enemy resistance, advanced to the Lunga River and at 4 p.m. captured the airfield. The main Marine force that came ashore on Guadalcanal encountered more difficulty with the island's foreboding jungle terrain, oppressively hot weather, and the confusion the inexperienced Americans had with offloading men and supplies than it did with the Japanese. Supplies were being unloaded as fast as the landing craft could make this turnaround from ship to shore. But the shore party was woefully inadequate to handle the influx of ammunition, ration, tents, aviation gas, vehicles, all gear necessary to sustain the Marines. The beach itself became a dump site, and almost as soon as the initial supplies were landed, they had to be moved to positions nearer Kukum Village and Lunga Point within the planned perimeter. Fortunately, the lack of Japanese ground opposition enabled Major General Vandegrift to shift the supply beaches west to a new beachhead. Japanese bombers did penetrate the American fighter screen on August 8th, and on the evening of August 8th through the morning of August 9th, the naval battle of Savo Island occurred, which Steve will cover after the land portion. As a result of the naval battle the previous night and the withdrawal of the American aircraft carrier, with no protection, on August 9th, the Marines' transports withdrew to Noumea, New Caledonia. The unloading of supplies ended abruptly, and the ship, still half full, steamed away. The forces ashore had 17 days' rations after counting captured Japanese food, only 4 days' supply of ammunition for all weapons. Not only did the ships take away the rest of the supplies, they also took the Marines still on board. The Marines felt the Navy had abandoned them. Ashore in the Marine beachheads, General Vandergrift ordered rations reduced to 2 meals a day. The reduced food intake would last for 6 weeks, and the Marines would become very familiar with Japanese canned fish and rice, which again is portrayed well in the Pacific HBO series. The retreating ships had also hauled away empty sandbags and valuable and engineer tools. So the Marines used Japanese shovels and filled Japanese rice bags with sand to strengthen their defensive positions. When the ships carrying barbed wire and engineering tools needed ashore left the Guadalcanal area, Marines had to prepare such hasty field expedients as this cheval de frise of sharpened stakes. The 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal initially concentrated on forming a loose defensive perimeter centered around Lunga Point and the airfield, moving what supplies had been brought ashore within the perimeter and completing the construction of the airfield. Over 4 days of intense effort, the supplies were moved from the landing beaches to dispersed dumps within the defensive perimeter. Work began on the airfield immediately, mainly using captured Japanese equipment. On August 12th, the airfield was named Henderson Field after Major Lofton R. Henderson, born in Lorain, Ohio, a Marine aviator who was killed during the Battle of Midway. By August 18th, the airfield was ready for operation. Henderson Field still exists today and is known as Honiara International Airport. Here are some pictures, again taken by Paul from his visit, of the airport taken on Guadalcanal. Any additional comments on that, Paul?
Well, the airport today is the exact location as Henderson Field was during the war. It's a very small airport. Basically, by our standards, it's just a one waiting room and a small ticket counter. They do have facilities like we do. You have to go through security, magnetometer, and so forth. But all around the area of Henderson Field or Hanarori International Airport are remains of World War II. When I was there in January of 2020. I spent a week. Most of the island today is pretty much under the control of China. And China wants to change the name of the airport to something of their design. But most of the shops around downtown are all Chinese run. Why they're trying to take over the island, I have no idea.
Same reason why they wanted it in 42.
Could be.
They wanted the coconut oil.
Paul, do you know how long the runway was?
No, I do not. I
I've
don't know how long the runway was.
got a picture of it currently that I'll.
Did jets operate from it? Jet aircraft?
Oh, yes, because I flew from Brisbane, Australia, on a Qantas airplane. They have a lot of air service in and out of the airport today.
Allied troops suffered from a severe strain of dysentery soon after landing, with 1 in 5 Marines afflicted by mid-August. Although some of the Korean construction workers surrendered to the Marines, most of the remaining Japanese and Korean personnel gathered just west of the Lunga perimeter on the west bank of the Matanakaw River and subsisted mainly on coconuts because they left all their food back at Henderson Field. A Japanese naval outpost was also located on Taivu Point, about 22 miles east of the Lunga perimeter. On August 8th, a Japanese destroyer from Rabaul delivered 113 naval reinforcement troops to the Matanakaw position. On the evening of August 12th, a 25-man U.S. Marine patrol led by Division D2 Lieutenant Colonel Frank Gocha of Canton, Ohio, and primarily consisting of intelligence personnel, landed by boat west of the Japanese perimeter at Matanakaw River on a reconnaissance mission with a secondary objective of contacting a group of Japanese troops that U.S. forces believed might be willing to surrender. Soon after the patrol landed, a nearby platoon of Japanese naval troops attacked it and almost completely wiped it out. There were 3 survivors. In response, on August 19th, Major General Vandergrift sent 3 companies of the 5th Marine Regiment to attack the Japanese troop concentration west of the Matanakaw, killing about 65 Japanese soldiers while losing 4 Marines. This action, sometimes referred to as the First Battle of the Matanakaw, was the first of several major actions around the Matanakaw River during the campaign. In response to the Allied landings, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters assigned the task of retaking Guadalcanal to the Imperial Japanese Army's 17th Army Corps. 17th Army, a corps-sized command based at Rabaul under the command of Lieutenant General, let me focus on this one, Harukushi Hyakutake. The Army was to be supported by the Japanese naval units, including the combined fleet under the command of Hirosoku Yamamoto, which was headquartered at Truk. The 17th Army, at this time heavily involved in the Japanese campaign in New Guinea, had only a few units available to allocate to Guadalcanal. The 35th Infantry Brigade, located at Palau, the 4th Aoba Infantry Regiment was in the Philippines, and the 28th Ichiki Regiment, under the command of Colonel Kiyodeo Ichiki, was berthed on transport ships near Guam. These units began to move towards Guadalcanal via Truk and Rabaul immediately, but Ichiki's regiment, being the closest, arrived in the area first. Ichiki, with 916 men of his regiment of 2,300 troops, designated the first element, and carrying 7 days' supply of food, were delivered to Taivu Point by 6 destroyers at 0100 on August 19th. So this group came by destroyer, whereas the rest of the units came by transport, which were much slower. Ichiki was ordered to scout the American positions and wait for the remainder of his force to arrive. Report from patrols of Solomon Islanders, along with Allied intelligence from other sources, indicated that Japanese troops were present east of Lunga Point. To investigate further, on August 19th, a Marine patrol of 60 men and 4 native scouts, commanded by a U.S. Marine Captain Charles H. Brush, marched east from the Lunga perimeter. At the same time, Ichiki sent forward his own patrol of 38 men, led by his communications officer, to reconnoiter Allied troop dispositions and establish a forward communication base. Around noon on August 19th at Coley Point, Brush's patrol sighted and ambushed the Japanese patrol, killing all but 5 of its members, who escaped back to Taivu. The Marines suffered 3 dead and 3 wounded. Papers discovered on the bodies of some of the Japanese officers in the patrol revealed that they belonged to a much larger unit and showed detailed intelligence of U.S. Marine positions around Lunga Point. Now anticipating an attack from the east, the U.S. Marines forces prepared their defenses on the east side of the Lunga perimeter. Learning of the annihilation of his patrol, Ichiki conducted a 9-mile night march toward the Marine perimeter. Just after midnight on August 21st, Ichiki's main body of troops arrived on the east bank of Alligator Creek. And you can see there's Tenaru River afterwards. The Marine maps had the wrong names of the rivers on them, so this battle is known by multiple names. I think it's actually the Tenaru River, but it's called Alligator Creek by the Marines. And we're surprised to encounter the Marine positions, not having expected to find U.S. forces so far from the airfield. Underestimating the strength of Allied forces on Guadalcanal, and perhaps with a bit of arrogance, Ichiki's units conducted a nighttime frontal assault on Marine positions on Alligator Creek in the early morning hours of August 21st. So here's a modern day view picture, and that's the current airfield. So you can see it's a lot longer than what Henderson Airfield would have been. But it's a modern aerial view of the area of the battle with Ichiki's intended plan overlaid. This is the area where the battle actually took place. Zooming in, you can see that the sandbar over which the Japanese forces made their suicidal charge. The Marines were ready for them with entrenched forces in this area. So the red is the Japanese, the blue is the Americans. The Marine perimeter extended along the green line. For those that have watched the HBO series The Pacific, this is the final scene of the first episode, is the Battle of Tenaru. Here is an aerial view of the same piece of ground at the time of the campaign, just after the battle in August. The Marines had extended barbed wire over the sandbars as a barrier. The Japanese forces charged right into it and the oncoming fire. Some of the Japanese forces, realizing the futility of the charge, waded out to sea and tried to move past the section of beach, but were noticed by the Marines and picked off one by one. The attack was defeated with heavy losses to the Japanese. After daybreak, the Marine units counterattacked Ichiki's surviving troops, killing many more of them. The dead included Ichiki. I don't remember who we were talking about over there, but in total, 774 of the 917 members of the Ichiki regiments, first elements, were killed in the battle, and 15 were captured. About 30 survived, enjoyed Ichiki's rear guard of about 100, and these 128 Japanese returned to Tavu Point, notified 17th Army headquarters of their defeat, and awaited further reinforcements and orders from Rabaul. So you can see it was a very lopsided attack. After the battle, the beaches were strewn with dead Japanese bodies, and the Japanese helmet came from the Tenru, around the Tenru River.
I found that helmet, yes, in Tenru River.
So this battle we're talking about is where that Japanese helmet would have come from. The beaches were strewn with dead Japanese bodies. The battle set another precedent that would continue throughout the war in the Pacific, which is the reluctance of the defeated Japanese soldiers to surrender and their efforts to continue killing Allied soldiers, even as the Japanese soldiers lay dying on the battlefield. On this subject, Major General Vandergrift remarked, quote, "I have never heard or read of this kind of fighting. These people refuse to surrender. The wounded wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves and the other fellow to pieces with a hand grenade," unquote. The naval battle of Eastern Solomon Islands occurred next on August 24th, 25th, which again Steve will cover after the land portion. The remainder of the 17th Army units mentioned earlier that were sailing in transports to Guadalcanal while this naval battle occurred, the convoy was attacked near Taivu Point by aircraft based at Henderson Field. After suffering heavy damage during the battle, including the sinking of one of the transports, the convoy was forced to divert to the Shortland Islands in the northern Solomons in order to transfer the surviving troops to destroyers for later delivery to Guadalcanal. After the Battle of Tenru, Major General Vandergrift continued to direct efforts to strengthen and improve the defenses of the Lunga perimeter. Between 21 August and September 3rd, he relocated three Marine battalions, including the 1st Raider Battalion under Merritt Edson and the 1st Parachute Battalion from Tulagi and Gavutu to Guadalcanal. These units added about 1,500 troops to Major General Vandergrift's original 11,000 men defending Henderson Field. The Parachute Battalion, which had suffered heavy casualties in the Battle of Gavutu-Tenambogo, was placed under Edson's command. The other relocated battalion, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, was landed by boat west of the Manataku River near Kokombono Village. On August 27th, with the mission of attacking Japanese units in the area, much as in the first Manataku action of August 19th. These actions resulted in the loss of 20 Japanese and 3 Marines. Small Allied naval convoys arrived at Guadalcanal on August 23rd and 29th and September 1st and 8th to provide the Marines at Lunga with more food, ammunition, aircraft fuel, aircraft technicians, and other supplies. The convoy on September 1st also brought 392 Seabees to maintain and improve Henderson Field. In addition, on September 3rd, Marine Aircraft Group 25 began airlifting high-priority cargo, including personnel, aviation, gasoline, munitions, and other supplies to Henderson Field. Between August 29th and September 4th, Japanese light cruisers, destroyers, and patrol boats were able to land almost 5,000 troops at Taivu Point, including most of the 35th Infantry Brigade, much of the Adobo 4th Regiment, and the rest of Ichiki's regiment. General Kawaguchi, who landed at Taivu Point on August 31st, was placed in command of all Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. A barge convoy took another 1,000 soldiers of Kawaguchi's brigade under the command of Colonel Akadasuka Oka, who's going to argue with me, to Kamimbo, over by Cape Esperance, and over here on this side, west of the Lunga perimeter. Here's a picture of the Japanese reinforcements arriving on Guadalcanal. You can see Savo Island in the background. On September 7th, Kawaguchi issued his attack plan to rout and annihilate the enemy in the vicinity of the Guadalcanal Island airfield. Kawaguchi's plan called for the forces under his command split into 3 divisions to approach the Lunga perimeter inland, culminating with the surprising night attack. Oka's forces would attack the perimeter from the west, while Ichiki's second echelon, renamed the Kuma Battalion, would attack from the east. The main attack would be conducted from the jungle south of the Lunga perimeter by Kawaguchi's central body, numbering 3,000 men in 3 battalions. By September 7th, most of Kawaguchi's troops had departed Taivu to begin marching toward Lunga Point along the coastline. About 250 Japanese troops remained behind to guard the brigade's supply base at Taivu. Meanwhile, native scouts under the direction of Coast Watcher Martin Clevens brought reports to the U.S. Marines of Japanese troops at Taivu near the village of Tasamboko. Edson subsequently planned a raid on the Japanese close troop concentration at Taivu. On September 8th, after being dropped off near Taivu by boat, Edson's men captured Tasamboko and forced the Japanese defenders to retreat into the jungle. In Tasamboko, Edson's troops discovered Kawaguchi's main supply depot, including large stockpiles of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and a powerful shortwave radio. After destroying everything in sight, aside from some documents and equipment that they carried back with them, the Marines returned to Lunga perimeter. Intelligence gathered from the captured documents indicated that at least 3,000 Japanese troops were on the island, planning to initiate a large-scale ground assault on the airfield in short order. Edson, along with Colonel Gerald C. Thomas, Vandergrift's operations officer, correctly anticipated that the main Japanese attack would fall on Lunga Ridge, a narrow, grassy, 1,000-yard-long coral ridge that ran parallel to the Lunga River, just south of Henderson Field. The ridge offered a natural avenue of approach to the airfield, commanded the surrounding area, and was almost undefended. On September 11th, 840 men of Edson's battalion were deployed onto and around the ridge and began digging in. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's 1st Battalion attacked the raiders between the Lunga River and the ridge, forcing one Marine company to fall back to the ridge before the Japanese halted their attack for the night. The next night, Kawaguchi faced Edson's 840 raiders with 3,000 troops of his brigade, reinforced by an assortment of light artillery. Throughout the night, the Marines at this position, supported by a battery of howitzers brought up from the Lunga Point, turned back wave after wave of frontal Japanese infantry attacks, several of which developed into hand-to-hand combat. The weight of these repeated assaults eventually presented the Marines back to within a quarter mile of the airfield. At this stage, the intensity of the battle reached an apex. Small groups of Japanese soldiers managed to break through Edson's line, with some reaching the edge of the airfield itself. Several Japanese soldiers were killed as they attempted to climb onto and destroy parked aircraft. However, Kawaguchi's units were spent, and the main Japanese attack on Edson's position ground to a halt. The supporting attacks by the Kuma Battalion and Oka's unit at the other locations on the Lunga perimeter were likewise defeated. On September 14th, Kawaguchi led the survivors of his shattered brigade on a 5-day march west to the Botanicao Valley to join with Oka's units. In total, Kawaguchi's forces lost about 850 killed, with the Marines suffering 104 killed and 278 wounded. The battle became known as the Battle of Edson's Ridge, or also known as the Battle of Bloody Ridge. On September 15th at Rabaul, Hyakutake learned of Kawaguchi's defeat and forwarded the news to Imperial General Headquarters in Japan. In an emergency meeting, the senior Japanese Imperial Japanese Army and Imperial Japanese Navy command staffs concluded that Guadalcanal might develop into a decisive battle of the war, end quote. The results of the battle now began to exert significant strategic impact on Japanese operations in other areas of the Pacific. So this picture of the Imperial General Headquarters, that's the Emperor in the middle there, the Navy staff is on the left, and the Army staff is on the right. Hyakutake realized that he could not send sufficient men and material to defeat the Allied forces on Guadalcanal while simultaneously supporting the major ongoing Japanese offensive on the Kokoda Tract in New Guinea. Hyakutake, with the concurrence of General Headquarters, ordered his troops on New Guinea, who were within 30 miles of the objective of Port Moresby, to withdraw until the, quote, Guadalcanal matter, end quote, was resolved. Hyakutake prepared to send more troops to Guadalcanal for another attempt to recapture Henderson Field. So this is pretty significant change. As the Japanese regrouped west of the Matanacao, the U.S. forces concentrated on shoring up and strengthening their Lunga defenses. On September 14th, Major General Vandergrift moved the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marine Regiment from Tulagi to Guadalcanal. On September 18th, the Allied naval convoy delivered 4,157 men from the 3rd Provisional Marine Brigade, which included the 7th Marine Regiment, plus a battalion from the 11th Marine Regiment, and some additional support units. So the 7th Marines are back. These crucial reinforcements allowed Major General Vandergrift, beginning on September 19th, to establish an unbroken line of defense around the Lunga perimeter. A lull occurred in the air war over Guadalcanal with no Japanese air raids between September 14th and 27th because of bad weather, during which both sides reinforced their respective air units. The Japanese immediately began to prepare for their next attempt to recapture Henderson Field. Tokyo Express runs brought food and ammunition, as well as 280 men from the 1st Battalion Aoba Regiment to Kabimbo Bay. Meanwhile, the Japanese 2nd and 38th Infantry Divisions were transported from the Dutch East Indies to Rabaul, beginning on September 13th. The Japanese planned to transport a total of 17,500 troops from these two divisions to Guadalcanal to take part in the next major attack on the Lunga perimeter by late October. So this is the sequel pitch here for December. From September 23rd through October 11th, the Marines conducted small operations and raids in the Matanacao Valley to try to disrupt the Japanese reorganization and to keep them west of the Matanacao and away from the Lunga perimeter. The naval battle of Cape Esperance took place on October 11th, 12th, which Steve will cover shortly. And now the Army arrives. Major General Millard F. Harmon, the F is Fillmore for Millard Fillmore. Harmon was the commanding general of U.S. Army forces in the South Pacific. He was an Army Air Force general. He convinced Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, Commander South Pacific Area, that U.S. Marine forces on Guadalcanal needed to be reinforced immediately if the Allies were to successfully defend the island from the next expected Japanese offensive. Thus, on October 8th, the 2,837 men of the 164th Infantry Regiment from the Americal Division boarded ships at New Caledonia for the trip to Guadalcanal with the projected arrival date of October 13th. To protect the transports carrying the 164th to Guadalcanal, Gormley ordered Task Force 64, consisting of 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers under U.S. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, which we'll hear about in a bit, to intercept and combat any Japanese ships that approached Guadalcanal and threatened the arrival of the transport convoy. The Battle of Cape Esperance ensued. Meanwhile, the convoy of U.S. Army troops reached Guadalcanal as scheduled on October 13th, successfully delivering its cargo and passengers to the island. To be continued in December. Yeah.
Steve, from the, zooming in on the slide, I couldn't quite tell the width of the slot. How wide was that? What was the breadth? And why could we not position unavailable shoreline and disrupt some of that Coastal Express?
We will later in the war.
Okay. The second question I had you answered, and it was how did the Coast Marine increase its ranks by new recruits or cannibalizing other battalions? You said 90% were new recruits from Pearl Harbor. In essence, does that mean here's your uniform, yes sir, as far as their training?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they didn't have replacements coming in during the battle. And in part two, come back in December, please. We're going to talk about how they were pretty beat up by the time they were pulled out and replaced by other Marine and Army units. So they had a tough fight for a couple of months there. But if you look at the casualties also, you know, they weren't taking anything as near as the Japanese were in the number of casualties they were taking. So.
Sent in new recruits for a hard fight.
Yep. Yes, sir.
A couple of things. Comment, this was the first land battle.
Yes.
Between the Japanese and the Americans. So they were really trying to ascertain what each one's strengths and weaknesses were at that point. I wish you would have covered what was the strategic value of the 3 islands that were taken before the landing in Guadalcanal.
But by us or for the Japanese?
Actually, for both.
Yeah, so the Japanese was, again, they wanted a forward basis to keep advancing south. And part of the problem with the Japanese was they were extending beyond their limits, so they didn't have enough resources to do that. But they were trying to build air bases to support the next leap to the next islands. Our reason for defending them, it's interesting because in Hornfischer's book, he talks about neither one really, there was nothing there for either one to really care about. Other than the seaplane base. It was a very deep water port which supported the seaplane base. And again, the Japanese wanted to continue to advance south. But the reason we went was because they were there. That's the only reason we were there. Because the Japanese were there. And we wanted to stop them.
There are supply routes to Australia.
Well,
Correct.
yeah, I'm going to jump in, and I'm not going to talk very much tonight, but I am going to answer that question. First of all, it was not the first time we fought the Japanese on the ground. My father-in-law and other people who fought in the Philippines would disagree with that assessment, okay? And a lot of those reports did get back, okay? But these are kids, basically. The bulk of the Marines, as Bob indicated, had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, and a huge number of teenagers. Now, the real reason we were there is because Admiral Ernie King wanted to be there, and he wanted to go kick butt in the Pacific. And in order to make that happen, he engaged in some shenanigans and some political maneuvering that would make any Chicago ward boss really proud of him, because he had a deal to make that happen. He had to outfox, first of all, a guy named Marshall.
Yeah, George Marshall.
George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, whose overriding objective was to invade Europe, if possible, in 1942 or early 43. He had to outfox a guy named Winston Churchill, FDR, and let's not forget this guy called MacArthur, who wanted to run everything in the Pacific, and King was not about to let that happen. He saw an opportunity at Guadalcanal to attack, okay? And he had good rationale, because if the Japanese had it, built that airbase, stiffened it enough, they could threaten Australia and our supply routes to Australia. Fortunately, the Imperial Japanese Army had its head stuck up its rear end, and all it could think about was conquering Port Moresby and pouring more men into that, okay? So that gave us the chance. And in fact, when we talk about the naval battles, and we're not going to do that tonight, it's too late, you guys have been sitting here, and I apologize for our poor planning, but one of the things the naval commander of the Japanese at Rabaul, the problem he had was getting the attention of the Imperial Army that we better do something about Guadalcanal. And it took time, and Bob pointed out how long it took before they started to assemble some real units and send them down there, okay? So that kind of answers that. You're pointing at somebody who...
Yes, question over there.
I just wondered if you, Bob, had any information on the contributions of the Allies, the Brits, the Australians, the New Zealanders?
Well, the Australians helped a lot, and we're going to see where they contributed pretty heavy naval units. Both of their heavy cruisers were there.
No,
Okay.
nothing on the land.
No, the Australian...
Other than Martin Clemens.
Yeah, Martin Clemens, but the Australian Army was stopping the Japanese in New Guinea, and that was critical, okay? But the Australian Navy sent 2 heavy cruisers representing the pride of the fleet. The New Zealanders sent a light cruiser, and their air crews also would eventually play a huge role in that South Pacific campaign. Other questions? Yes? Yeah?
Yeah, listen, you did a really good job in explaining that. But I will make one comment in regards to the Philippines and Guadalcanal. Up until 1940, well, actually late 41, early 42, the U.S. military was really in dire condition. The enlisted men were the dregs of society, since the military was frowned upon after 1919. The officer corps was pretty much a country club type of environment. So when we take a look at the Philippines being invaded, it wasn't the best U.S. Army that could have been fielded. However, when we were talking about the new recruits that came in from Guadalcanal, and one thing that Marshall did very well is he was able to figure out who was a true leader and who had to be moved aside.
We got a guy up here that did a presentation on that, what, a year ago? Dan Zeiser, yeah.
Yeah.
Talked about George
Last
Marshall
year.
and creating the U.S. Army, okay, for World War II.
I would disagree with you on the state of the U.S. Army going into the war. It had increased quite a bit from a few 100,000 to about 1.5 million by
December 41.
by Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and the
right.
training had been increased quite a bit. So
But the
it was in pretty darn good shape.
Okay, but the Philippines, and then nothing against, relatives or whatever, but the Philippines was really
So the Philippines were a mess, okay?
Yeah.
So let's,
yeah.
My
Yeah.
father was a prisoner of war in the Philippines.
yeah, so was my wife's father, so,
Really?
yeah.
So, yeah.
He was in the Navy and he ended up fighting as an infantryman.
Quite a bit.
Yeah.
Well, for Guadalcanal, if the Japanese took the airfield, you could start bombing Australia at will.
Well, they could bomb some places in northern Australia. Australia's huge, I mean.
But you can't get anything in if you're bombing the sea lanes. You can't
Well,
resupply
that's
Australia.
the thing, and we'll talk about this next time, and I apologize, we should have done better job planning, but the Japanese, all of their air services, the Imperial Navy Air Service in particular, focused on long-range and attack capability, which served them in good stead for a bit. But as soon as we got Henderson Field, that was like putting a bone in their throat, okay? It's like, everybody here knows about the Battle of Britain, right? Okay. Battle of Britain. What was the German problem in the Battle of Britain?
They stopped bombing the airfields.
Well, they stopped bombing. What else?
And they only
And
had
they
20
had radar
minutes.
stations.
Yeah, they only had 20 minutes over Britain. And if their guys got shot down, what happened to them? They got captured for the most part. Well, the Japanese had to fly 500 miles from Rabaul to get to Guadalcanal before they could even fight. So that was like a 2-hour flight for most of them, okay? And then they had to fly 2 hours back, right? The Navy had to come down that 500 miles and time it so they got there at night, because otherwise the guys on Henderson Field would be scrambling to go after them, okay? Yeah, there's a question over here.
Well, I was just going to say about the New Zealanders that their main supply route did not run through northern Australia. It ran through the south, even past where New Zealand is.
Yeah, it was,
Okay,
yeah.
and then to Perth, which was the main port where they went in.
Yeah.
I know, because my father was in both places, from 42
It's
to 45.
a long way, yeah, right. Any other questions? Yeah.
Okay, how much did Admiral Leahy help Admiral King plan this, get the go-ahead to go with Guadalcanal?
That's a good question. What I have been able to learn from some other books besides these, he helped grease the skids with FDR because he was a Navy guy, and they wanted to get in a fight somewhere. You know, they've been kicked around at Pearl Harbor and other things, so they were looking for a fight. Okay, so we'll get into that, and we'll get into the Rodney Dangerfield of the Japanese Navy, and the darkness of Savo Island, and then coming back. And you know, Bob made a big point about the Navy abandoning the Marines. Well, that lasts about 10 days. Okay. And one of the things, so much, we need to do a show on between the wars and what really went on, that we were able to quickly mobilize and do things. And one of the things the Navy did was it thought long and hard about the Pacific War, and they converted 10 old World War I destroyers. 6 of them became amphibious, big long name for them, but basically they became a way to carry either a company of 150 Marines or an equivalent amount of supplies somewhere and unload them with built-in equipment and landing craft and get them ashore and then get out in a quick way. So half a dozen of those were at Guadalcanal, and within like 10, 11 days they were transporting troops and supplies back in. Well, meanwhile, the Japanese, if they sent a transport in, it was probably going to get sunk. So they were using barges, which they were towing, or they would bring a destroyer in, but they didn't have the built-in equipment like we did. So they were using longboats and putting them in life rafts and telling them to swim, and they were dumping barrels of supplies off and hoping they would drift into shore, okay? And yeah, our guys, we made a lot of mistakes, okay? But we did a lot of things right too. That's why we won. And the one thing that I want to leave you with tonight, because we're going to quit in about 2 minutes. Bob and I, in doing this research, have come to have so much respect and humility regarding the men who did this, from the privates on up to the generals and the admirals. They had to invent all this on the go. You know, and I made a joke about what you do last summer. Well, you know, Admiral Turner and General Vandegrift invented amphibious warfare. Okay? Yeah, we had theories and we had people building stuff, but they did the invasion with one rehearsal. One rehearsal.
A failed rehearsal.
It didn't go well. Yeah. So thank you all for coming. And